Our story this morning is from John's Gospel. And I've talked before about how in the lectionary that we read through the years, we have the three Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke. We call them the synoptics because they tend to follow each other in their timelines, and they have very similar content, though each one has its own peculiarities. But John's Gospel is somewhat different from all the rest. It doesn't follow the same timeline. He tells different stories. And one of the things about John's Gospel is that he doesn't tell as many miracles. John uses 7 miracles in his Gospel, or 7 signs to further the story that he's giving. And last week I spoke on Epiphany, and I talked about how Epiphany represents Jesus being introduced to the world as God become man, and how when we celebrate the coming of the wise men, we celebrate Jesus' introduction as God-man to the Gentiles, to the rest of the world aside from his own people. And in early times in Christianity, when they would have their earliest celebrations, would have been one of 3 celebrations as the church calendar. I wouldn't say evolved, because it wouldn't be formal enough to even be even near that. But our records show that the earliest celebrations included 3 particular celebrations from what we would see in Scripture, and Jesus' baptism, and the infancy story, or Jesus' birth, and this story, the story of Jesus turning water to wine at the wedding in Cana. And these are the 3 stories that would have been celebrated around the same time as we celebrate Epiphany, and some all together and some separate, and they've become somewhat separate in our lectionary now, where we would have normally the Epiphany during the week or on the Sunday right after the New Year, and then we would have the reading about the baptism of Jesus, and then we would have this story about the wedding in Cana. And another thing about John's Gospel that you should keep in mind is that in John's Gospel, there is no account of Jesus' baptism. John has John the Baptist talking about Jesus being the Lamb, and he has John the Baptist saying that he saw the Spirit of God descend onto Jesus, but he never tells the story of John baptizing Jesus. Instead, we have this introduction, and then, we have his prologue that we read from a couple weeks ago. We have the prologue in which John basically tells us that Jesus is God. And then we run into this. We jump into the story, and we have John talking about behold the Lamb of God as Jesus walks by, and some of John's disciples start following Jesus. And then Jesus calls another disciple, Philip, to follow him, and this is the beginning of John's Gospel. And our story this morning is introduced with the words, "the next day." And the next day there was a wedding and celebration in Cana. And apparently, Jesus' mother and his family were invited to this wedding. I say that because when I read this, and when I think about the stuff that I've read about the culture and stuff, it's very likely, if Jesus were further into his ministry, that he and his disciples would be invited just because they had honor, and that would bring honor to the celebration. But at this point, it's very early in Jesus' ministry, and we have very little indication that he was doing much ministering yet, and also his mother is there. This is in the Galilean area. We have it's not that far from where Jesus lived, and I assume that there's a family connection to whoever's being married, and Jesus' family has been invited. And he's brought along these guys that he's been gathering to himself. So his first sign takes place at a wedding. And a few things that we should remember about weddings in this culture is that weddings went on for days. This would be a very big party, and it would have a lot to do with the celebration, and the length and the size of it would have a lot to do with how well off the family. I believe it's the bride's family who gives this celebration. How well off they are in order to provide for the celebrants, the people that are invited to the wedding. But it's like a big banquet, and there's food and there's wine, of course. And I assume there's music and celebration, whatever that looks like. But at this wedding, the bride's family, the host's family, is running out of wine. And Jesus' mother tells him they're running out of wine. And it's so... There's so many things in this story, and one of the things that I've always loved the most about this story is it just feels so real. It feels so human. Mom says to Jesus, they're running out of wine. And, as a son, my response would be, yeah, so? What do you want me to do about it? And Jesus' response isn't that far off. He says, that's not our concern. It's not my time yet. And I'm not sure what that means, it's not my time yet. But to run out of wine at the wedding is a very bad thing. It would bring dishonor to the family. It wouldn't be good for them. It would lower their standing in the eyes of the people of the community. It would make them feel terrible, but it would hamper their interactions with their friends and their neighbors and the people that they have to interact with as part of their everyday lives. And by have to, I don't just mean that you can't avoid them. I mean that the commerce of life in this kind of culture depends on your honor standing. It depends on your relationships within the community, much, much more than ours. You don't go to a grocery store and just hand them money and buy things. More often than not, you trade things, you trade favors, and it's all about this relational type of stuff, which is very important. And of course, Jesus' response is, my time is not yet come. And it seems like Jesus wasn't ready to start performing miracles yet. It seems like, almost like what Mary has said to him is unexpected, or comes as a surprise, or as something that he would like to avoid for the moment. Maybe Jesus didn't think this was the best place for his first sign or miracle. Maybe God the Father had better ideas. I don't know. But this is the way the story comes to us. But it also seems like Mary doesn't care whether Jesus thinks this is the right time or not. And this is back to that humanness of the story. In John's account, what we see in Mary is this very human concern for family or friends that have run into trouble. And apparently, Mary has some idea that Jesus can do something about it. And we don't have stories in what we call the canon of the Bible that we treat, that the church treats as gospel. We don't have stories of Jesus' life between the one that Kim read and this one, really. And between the one that Kim read and the ones that we had at Christmas, there aren't any stories, pretty much. There's the Christmas stories, there's the story of Jesus in the temple at 12, and then there's the beginning of his ministry. And this is pretty much what we know about Jesus' life before he starts ministering. But Mary knew. Mary had all kinds of things treasured up in her heart. Remember that? She knew. And so she ignores Jesus' response and says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. That's kind of cool, right? I have this image of a mother who, just goes ahead and wrangles her son into whatever it is that she needs done anyway. And, excuse me, one of the things I'd like to highlight at this point in the story is that normally in these kind of celebrations, we'll envision a regular wedding like we have, and the men and the women are all together and everybody's in one place and all the rest of it. But that's not really the way it works. Like, when I read the story, I sort of have this image of Jesus at one of the tables You know how there's tables at weddings, all those, a round table in the back corner of the hall with his disciples and his mom, maybe some of his siblings, and his mom's been out mingling. Maybe he's not sitting with his mom. Maybe he's just sitting with his friends, and his mom's been mingling, and she comes over to him and tells him, this stuff. But that's not quite the way it works. In this culture, the men are in a room, usually by themselves, and they're reclined at tables that are laid out in a way that indicates who has the greatest honor in this celebration. And in another place, usually the women are together. And the servants just are invisible, right? The servants come and go, but they don't stick around. So the way in which John tells this story highlights the idea that Jesus, even though he's beginning this ministry, and even though his words to his mother sound like he's too, like he holds himself away from his mother, who's a woman, and that he's above doing a miracle at a wedding, even though that kind of there's a bit of it sounds a bit like that, the way it's framed, we also have to remember that whatever's going on, Jesus is not above being with his mother in a public place. He's not above servants, and his mother and Jesus are all in proximity, so that when his mother talks to the servants, Jesus hears it. Jesus is not likely at the head table. He's not likely hanging out with the people of consequence. Even in John's gospel, in the first circumstances of Jesus' ministry, the first miracle that he performs in John's gospel, he's with the people on the edges, on the fringes. And so Jesus ends up helping anyway. And it says that there are 6 water jars used for ceremonial washing. And what that's all about is, in Jewish law, they were required to cleanse their hands and their utensils before they ate. Well, that just makes good sense, right? And it certainly it's like having hand sanitizer at the entrances and exits of all public buildings. And when we're at home and stuff, we go in and we wash our hands plenty because of the viruses, right? Well, in Jewish culture, it became a ceremonial thing that you had to wash your hands before any meals. And so a good host, especially for a big event like this, would have plenty of water available for his guests to come, and they would dip their hands in the water and then shake the water off, and that was a ceremonial cleansing in order to go in. And apparently in this gathering, wherever they were, there were 6 of these huge, probably stone jars, these large jars that held 20 or 30 gallons of water each. Who wants to do the math? 120 to 180 gallons, right, of water in these things. And Jesus tells them to fill them up, make sure they're full. And it's interesting that that's it. Like he doesn't stand over the jars. He doesn't wave his hands over them. As far as we know, he doesn't even go to them, right? He's He's laying down at a table, because that's what they do in this culture and time. And the servants are they're like, well, what do you want us to do? And he says, okay, well, see the water jars? Go make sure they're full. And then take a ladle full of water, dip out some water, and take it to the master of the feast. It's kind of like an MC, or if you're at a banquet hall and the person who's in charge of the banquet hall, that would be that kind of person, right? Somebody that has not likely been hired, but has a connection to the family and does this as a favor or as an honor kind of thing. But anyway, they have a position, and everybody understands that they're in charge of making sure everything runs smoothly, and maybe even in this culture, making sure that that the families behave in the way that they're expected at this kind of ceremony. So a little bit like a wedding coordinator too, right? But he's the guy that gets to check and make sure the wine's good enough to serve to everybody, apparently. And so they bring the wine to him, and he tastes the wine, and now it's water, right? They bring the water to him, and now it's wine, right? There's no mumbo jumbo. There's no laying on of hands. There's no pronouncement. There's just fill the jars up, take some of the water to the master of the ceremonies. And now the water is now wine. And the master of ceremonies, he takes the water. Oh, before I do that, I'm going to bring that slide up. But the master of ceremonies, when he tastes the water that has become wine, he doesn't know that it was water. He just figures they're bringing him wine to check out to make sure it's good to give. And he tastes it. And then there's this aside that John includes, but of course the servants knew. Well, of course they did because they filled the water. But this is, again, another one of these nuggets or gems in this story, right? Here we have this story that Jesus is going to perform this miracle. And to the best of our knowledge, there's no telling of the fact that the people at the banquet find out that the miracle was done. Okay, from what I've learned and what I've studied about this culture, they found out eventually. Maybe not that night, although I have a pretty good hunch they would have found out that night, because communication in that society is basically by the gossip tree, right? The gossip, the whatever you want to call it. People tell people and people tell people. But considering the fact that the first people to know that Jesus had done a miracle, a sign in John's gospel, were the servants. And considering that they were the first, that chain of events in which people would have found out would have been from the lowest to the highest, not the other way around. And of course, we know that the wine that Jesus made was of such high quality that the master of ceremonies has to call over the bridegroom and say, wow, this is out of the ordinary. Everybody usually serves the good stuff at the beginning, and then when everybody's had enough to drink and won't notice, then they serve the cheaper stuff. But you've kept the best wine until last. John wanted to make sure we knew that when Jesus makes wine, it's good wine, right? No half measures, I guess. This miraculous sign was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. See, in John's gospel, Jesus is being revealed. Well, John gives away the secret at the beginning of the story, right? In his prologue. The Word became flesh, and all who believed became part of that family of God, children of light. And then he starts the story about Jesus. And the story's kind of unassuming at the beginning, right? Jesus is walking along, and somebody else, John the Baptist, points him out. And some of John's followers start tagging along. And then they invite people, and they start tagging along. And then Jesus goes and picks up Philip, oddly enough. Just, that's the one that Jesus decides he's going to add to the numbers. And then they're at a wedding. And at this wedding, Jesus does his first sign, presumably at the urging of his mother. He's a good boy, does what his mother wants. And he is revealed, his glory is revealed to the servants first, and from there on up. But throughout John's gospel, there will be signs, and there will be stories, and there will be teachings about what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God, to be the Word become flesh. And it's about this revelation of glory, and it builds up to the cross. And then it ends with, and his disciples believed in him. So this really is an important start to Jesus' story in this gospel, right? Because he does his first sign, and then these fellows who have been following along, who were curious because of what John said, John the Baptist, and then because of what other people who had met him said, and then we have the story of Nathanael who is impressed because Jesus says he saw him under this fig tree, and Jesus says to Nathanael, says, "You're going to see the Son of Man, angels going to and from heaven on the Son of Man." He says, you're going to see much bigger things than this. And the beginning of them is water becomes wine at a wedding. In her heart. Why a wedding? So why a wedding, right? Well, first of all, First off, it's an important part of everyday life. I talked about that already a little bit, right? This is so real. It's so human. It's so relatable. Everyone in the culture that would have heard this story or read this story has been to a wedding. They know what weddings look like. They know how they take place, and they can relate to the circumstances of the story. Maybe part of the reason it was a wedding was because, just as we said, the servants are first to know, and the servants would make sure this story gets spread around. It would make sure that there was a wide dispersal of the story. But also, I don't know if you recall our Old Testament reading, especially near the end, throughout the scriptures, marriage is a metaphor for God's relationship with God's people. It's a symbol and a sign of God's commitment and faithfulness. It's often also a symbol and a sign of God's people's unfaithfulness and lack of commitment. But it is a very powerful symbol that God uses throughout the scriptures. And for God to use that wedding as the beginning and the first sign, I think, is important. And why wine? See, I was raised in the Free Methodist Church in Thunder Bay while I was out in the country, church in the country. I was raised that abstinence was required to be a Free Methodist, and that every good Christian, that good Christians didn't drink alcohol, right? I was raised to see abstinence from alcohol as a sign of holiness. And, growing up, that became a bit of a contention, especially our Catholic friends and neighbors who had no problem drinking wine, because after all, it was part of the communion, and it was part of Jesus' story, right? He makes wine, he drinks wine, they have wine at the Last Supper. It's silly to think that Jesus would abstain. And yet somehow in my culture, in my church culture, I grew up thinking that somehow this wasn't real wine. It was just grape juice or something like that. And when I went to high school and I took my first history of technology class, one of the early things I learned in the class was that, chemically speaking, in an ancient culture where it's hot and you don't have refrigeration and stuff, you crush grapes and it makes wine. Sure, it's juice the day you made it, but that's about the end of the story there. Within days, fermentation starts, and that creates wine. Now, if that's all you did, it wouldn't be really good wine. But the point is, you can't have juice in an ancient culture without the extra chemicals or refrigeration to keep the juice from fermenting. It's the natural process of how things work. We had good reasons, good cultural reasons for abstinence. Our church still has, the Free Methodist Church still has, as part of their beliefs, that we prefer abstinence, that it is something that is seen as an ideal, and it's as an act of love. That's where it came from, and we did a lot of work 20, 30 years ago in the church to make sure that we sort of got back to the understanding that we didn't do this because it was a sign of holiness. We did this because sometimes, or a lot of the times, alcohol can cause real problems in our society. And by abstaining, we can create an example of how to avoid those problems. We show love and care for people who have difficulties or who have been harmed by people with difficulties. But see, it lost sight of the reason and became rigid and simply became a sign of holiness. And for me, when I read the story, it's a reminder that anything can be like that. That any act of holiness can become, and not just can, it often does, within the church, we forget why we do things, and we think the thing is holy, rather than the reason we do it is supposed to be holy. And what it accomplishes is supposed to be holy. But Jesus is at a party, a celebration, and he makes wine because they're running out. Why wine? Because that's what was needed. They didn't need orange juice. They didn't need clean water. They didn't need 7-Up or something else. They needed wine. And if he had made Welch's grape juice, the master of the ceremonies wouldn't have praised the groom or whoever for the quality of the wine. There would have been something wrong with it. Maybe he would have said, wow, this is the freshest wine I've ever tasted. But why new wine? Why not something that's actually wine? He made it because that's what they needed. But you know what else? I believe that this story tells us that Jesus cared about the celebration. He didn't have to do this miracle. Was he cajoled by his mother? Well, he was kind of cornered, but he still could have said no. He didn't have to. He cared about the celebration. He cared about the honor of the host family. He cared about people's happiness and ability to continue to celebrate a wedding, to celebrate the union of two people that were going to be joined together and create a new family, to be part of their own family, and he cared about preserving that family and their position in their community. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that it's important for us to understand that Jesus cares. He cares about us. He cares about you. And he doesn't just care if you're saved, and he doesn't just care if you're sick or not. He cares about the mundane things of your life, the life things. He cares that you get enjoyment out of being with your family. He cares that you are well when you go into school tomorrow, Linda. He cares that you bring some of the joy that he's given you to your children tomorrow. He cares that when we go into a grocery store, whether or not we can share some of the joy that he gives us with the people we meet and see. Jesus wants his creation to become like he intended it to be. And Jesus wants us to enjoy the good gifts that God has given to all of his people. Food, fellowship, our physical existence, the amazing world of creation, created world around us. God and Jesus intend for us to thrive, not just survive. It's been a rough couple of years, and it's not over yet. There are signs that it's going to get pretty rough in the near future before it gets better. But Jesus wants us to be able to enjoy the little things and the good things whenever we can. And I want you to remember that this morning. I'd like you to take that with you. He cares that we will one day again be able to share celebrations together. But while we're waiting for that, he also cares that we enjoy the little things that we get to. We don't have to live. Being a Christian doesn't mean going around beating ourselves up all the time. I've talked over this Christmas season, especially just after Christmas, about how this is about Jesus becoming human in every way because God loves and values our physical human beings. And in becoming one of us, Jesus has said, this is meaningful. The things you do in your physical body are meaningful. And they're wonderful and they're gifts from God. And weddings and wine and fellowship and all the good things of life are things that God intends us to take joy in and to remember that he's given us these good gifts.